Hello students, in this class, let's go to the second unit on the topic demand analysis. Under this demand analysis, let's look into the law of diminishing marginal utility. But before we start with the law of diminishing marginal utility, let's briefly look into the concepts, namely consumption and utility. Consumption refers to the satisfaction of human wants by using goods and services. Consumption is the starting point of all economic activities. The power of goods and services to satisfy the wants is called utility. Consumption depends on utility, which can be shown as C is F of U. That is, consumption has a functional relationship with utility. C refers to consumption, F to functional relationship, and U to utility. Consumption, that is C, is determined by utility, that is U. Utility is the want satisfying power. We consume goods and services because they satisfy our wants. Consumption takes place because of the usefulness of the goods and services. Dr. Alfred Marshall used money as the measuring rod of utility. Consumption takes place by comparing the use, that is, utility of the product and its price. So we can also say consumption depends on the price of the goods and services. That is, C has a functional relationship with the price. Now let's look into the two concepts, namely cardinal utility and ordinal utility. In economics, quite often, the use of two terms, that is cardinal utility and ordinal utility, is made to explain the behavior of consumers through different approaches. The terms cardinal and ordinal are borrowed from mathematics. The number 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. are cardinal numbers. The number 2, for example, is twice the size of 1, and 3 is thrice the size of 1. Similarly, 4 is twice the size of 2. Here it only means that the cardinal numbers are quantifiable. In contrast, that is with regard to ordinal numbers, the numbers first, second, third, fourth, etc. are ordinal numbers. These ordinal numbers are not quantifiable. Ordinal numbers can be ranked or ordered. Just from ranking, there is no way of knowing the size of, say, 50, 60, and 75. In other words, ordinal numbers does not reveal the actual size of the numbers. Professor Marshall used the cardinal approach to analyze the consumer behavior, and money is used as the measuring rod of utility. The amount of utility derived from the consumption of all the units at the disposal of the consumer is total utility. Here we are going to differentiate between the two concepts, namely total utility and marginal utility. What is total utility? Total utility is the amount of utility derived from the consumption of all the units at the disposal of the consumer. So total utility of a commodity X is a function of the quantity of X consumed. So we say total utility is a direct function of quantity of the commodity in consideration. Symbolically, we can say TUX is equal to function of QX, where delta TUX divided by delta QX is always greater than 0. Here, TUX refers to total utility of good X. QX refers to quantity of commodity X. With the largest stock, total utility tends to be more, and with the smaller stock, total utility tends to be less. But total utility cannot be negative or less than 0. So this is total utility. Now, what is marginal utility? The utility derived from an additional unit is called marginal utility. Marginal unit is that unit which yields the least utility in the various uses of the commodities. Now, if you see symbolically, we say MUX is equal to TUX minus TUX minus 1. MUX refers to the marginal utility of X units. TUX refers to the total utility of X units. TUX minus 1 refers to the total utility of X minus 1 units, that is the previous unit. Now we can understand this distinction better with the computation of a table, namely the computation of marginal utility. Now, if you look into the table, the first column shows units of consumption. The second column shows total utility of commodity X. And the third column shows marginal utility. How do we calculate marginal utility? It is TUX minus TUX minus 1. So in the table, you see that the total utility goes on increasing with increased consumption, while the marginal utility decreases throughout. To find out marginal utility, we may use a formula, namely MUX is equal to delta TUX divided by delta QX. Now, what is this delta TUX? It is the change in the total utility of commodity X divided by the quantity of X. If you look at the table, you will see from the first unit of the commodity of X commodity consumed, the total utility derived is 20. When the consumer goes in for the consumption of an additional unit, namely the second unit, the total utility derived becomes 35. So in the first unit of consumption, marginal utility is 20. In the second unit of consumption, how do we calculate the marginal utility? you take the total utility of the second unit minus the total utility of the first unit. That is 35 minus 20, which will be 15. Likewise, you go on calculating the marginal utility. For the third, you see 45 minus 35, that is 10. Then 53 minus 45, 8, and so on. So if you just see, total utility of the first unit of x is 20 and the second unit of x is 35. So the marginal unit utility of x is equal to delta TUX, that is 35 minus 20 is 15, divided by delta QX, which how many units is consumed extra? 1 unit. The change in the unit is 1. So 15 divided by 1, that is equal to 15. So utility maximization is the aim of every consumer. Here you see that when total utility is maximum, marginal utility is 0. The aim of utility maximization is achieved. Now let's go to the main law, namely the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, what is this law of diminishing marginal utility? The law of diminishing marginal utility shows the inverse relationship between the units of consumption and marginal utility of a commodity. According to this law, when a person consumes the same commodity continuously, the marginal utility from the additional unit decreases. In the words of Marshall, according to Marshall, the law of diminishing marginal utility is explained this way. It says, the additional benefit which a person derives from a given increase of his stock of a thing diminishes with every increase of the stock that he already has. It simply means that when a consumer goes in for the consumption of more and more of a particular commodity, the benefit derived from the additional unit goes on diminishing. Thus, the law of diminishing marginal utility shows the inverse relationship between the units of consumption and the marginal utility of a commodity. This law, namely the law of diminishing marginal utility, is based on certain assumptions. Now, what are these assumptions? The first assumption is that the law is based on cardinal measurement of utility. This is the basic assumption of Marshall's theory of consumer behavior. The law of diminishing marginal utility assumes that the consumer is capable of expressing the utility numerically. And the second assumption is, we call it ceteris paribus, which means other things being constant. The law of diminishing marginal utility assumes that the factors influencing the consumption are constant. The price of the commodity in question is always assumed to be given, and it assumes other factors such as income, price of related goods, taste, fashion, preferences, and other determinants of consumption to be unchanged. That is what we mean by the concept ceteris paribus, which means other factors influencing consumption are always assumed to be constant. Yet another assumption is the rationality. Rationality is another basic assumption of the law. Rationality implies the attempt to maximize the satisfaction. The law of diminishing marginal utility assumes rationality on the part of the consumer, which means every consumer aims at achieving maximum satisfaction. That is what we mean by rationality. And the next assumption is that the law of diminishing marginal utility assumes the marginal utility of money to remain constant. We know that the law assumes that the marginal utility of everything decreases. But when it comes to money, it assumes that it remains constant. Since money is used as the measuring rod of utility, this assumption has to be made, otherwise, the law will not work. And the next assumption is continuity. The law assumes continuity in consumption. Continuity implies consumption of the units of a same commodity one after another successively without any time interval. When you say continuity, it means suppose you want to measure the utility of the bananas that you consume. The consumption of one banana in the morning and another one in the evening will not diminish the marginal utility. If you want to measure the marginal utility, you have to consume it without any time interval. Only then this law can be applied. And the next assumption is homogeneity. When you say homogeneity, it means the products should be identical. The law operates only when the units of consumption are homogeneous or identical. Homogeneity implies similarities in quality, size, color, flavor, taste, appearance, and so on. If the units are both homogeneous, the law will not hold good. For example, if the first orange consumed is sour and the second one is sweet, the law will not operate. And the next assumption is that the law also assumes the units of consumption to be a standard one. The law operates only when the units of consumption are of a reasonable size and of a standard unit. For example, when you consume coffee, you should always take it as a cup of coffee and not a spoon of coffee, because that is a standard unit. So these are some of the assumptions that we make before going in for the illustration of the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now let's go to the illustration of the law. According to the law of diminishing marginal utility, continuous consumption of the same commodity decreases the marginal utility. It has been noted here the total utility increases, but at a diminishing rate. Now, why does the consumer consume the same commodity continuously? Two reasons can be given to explain this. One, satiability of particular wants. Human wants are unlimited, and the means to satisfy the wants are scarce. Multiplicity of wants make satisfaction of all wants impossible, but some wants can be completely satisfied. To satisfy some wants, it is necessary to consume the same commodity continuously. When the desire for successive units becomes less intense, the utility from successive units diminishes. And the second reason attributed to continuous consumption of the same commodity is imperfect substitution of commodities. Since commodities are not perfect substitutes to each other, consumers have to consume the same commodity continuously. Then, obviously, marginal utility will definitely decrease. Now, we can illustrate the law with the help of a table. If you just look at the table, you will understand the law of diminishing marginal utility. Now, here is the utility schedule. The first column shows the units of consumption, and here we have taken the commodity as idlis. And the second one shows the total utility. And the third one shows marginal utility. Now, if you look at the table, you just see the sixth unit consumed. When the consumer consumes the sixth unit, marginal utility is 0. This 0 marginal utility indicates full satisfaction arising out of excess consumption. You see here that in the table you see as more and more units of the commodities are consumed, the total utility goes on increasing from 10 to 18 to 23, 26, 27, remains constant, and then it starts declining, say, to 25. And if you look at the marginal utility, you see it goes on decreasing continuously. It even becomes 0 and it even gets negative. So, when the marginal utility is 0, the total utility is the maximum. You have to note down that. When the total marginal utility is 0, the total utility is maximum. That is, the consumption of the sixth unit, the consumer achieves the maximum satisfaction. Thus, according to this law, marginal utility of a commodity varies inversely with its number. You just see the first column and the last column. As units of commodity consumed increases from 1 to 2, 2 to 3, and so on, the marginal utility goes on decreasing from 10 to 8, 8 to 5, 5 to 3. So we say that there is an inverse relationship between marginal utility of a commodity and the units of consumption. So this graph is drawn based on the schedule. In this figure, if you see, OX axis represents units of consumption. That is the horizontal axis. And OY axis, that is the vertical axis, measures marginal utility. MU is the marginal utility curve. It slopes downwards to right, indicating an inverse relationship between marginal utility and units of consumption. That is, when the stock of the commodity increases, the marginal utility decreases. If you look at the figure, you note that the point at which MU intersects the OX axis is the point of full satisfaction. Further downward slope of the curve indicates negative values. The entire area covered by the marginal utility curve represents the total utility of the commodity. So, in the next class, we will discuss as to how a consumer arrives at an equilibrium with the help of this marginal utility and total utility. This is all for now. Thank you.